I think we're ready to go and we're live. So hello everybody. I can see that we have an audience and I think we're ready to start. So welcome to the second seminar in our series, Writing Slavery into Australian History. My name is Jane Lydon. I'm a historian at the University of Western Australia and I'm chairing this second seminar. We're privileged to be hearing from Associate Professor Emma Christopher today from the University of New South Wales. Emma's latest book is called Freedom in White and Black and is the story of the only two men shipped to Australia as convicts for the crime of slave trading and the enslaved men, women and children rescued from them. She previously published Slave Ship Sailors and Their Captive Cargoes, 2006, and A Merciless Place, in 2011, which won both the Kay Daniels and Ernest Scott Prizes. He's the co-editor with Marcus Rediker and Cassandra Pybus of Many Middle Passages, Forced Migration and the Making of the Modern World, an edited collection published in 2007. But she's also a documentary filmmaker, and this is how I first came across Emma's work, through her astonishing film, They Are We, which she made in 2014, which won 5 Best Documentary Awards, featured widely in the media, and was chosen as the United Nations Remembrance of Slavery film in 2015. It's screened in more than 70 countries around the world. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon described the film and Emma's work as an inspiration, a victory over slavery. So welcome to Emma. So please make yourself heard and seen. Emma, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Jane. Okay. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Jane. Okay, I would like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which I live here in the inner west of Sydney. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. And especially because of the subject of this paper today, I'd also like to make clear that that includes people of Australian South Sea Islander origin, and I will get onto that in a moment. Secondly, I'd like to really thank Jane for inviting me to give this paper and her generosity inviting me to contribute to the amazing project that she's running. I'm not really formally a part of it, so that's extremely generous of her. And thanks also to Alan, who I'm sure isn't with us, and Zoe and all of the others who are involved. And I'm actually really glad that this paper follows on from Jane's because it feeds into so many of the themes that she was mentioning last week. I'm going to try and share my screen. Hopefully this works. Okay, I'm hoping you can see this. Okay, so my own work is about the links between the legacies of British slavery and the Australian sugar industry. Jane mentioned a sugar grower in Western Australia last week, but for those of you who don't know, the sugar industry eventually took off in Queensland and in northern New South Wales in the 1860s. This is just footage I shot in Queensland more recently than that, obviously. So here's a small map of where sugar took off, mostly right the way up the Queensland coast, although it did also stretch down into northern New South Wales. And from then until the Federation of Australia and the introduction of the White Australia policy, it relied mostly on Pacific Islanders, then most commonly known as South Sea Islanders. And the descendants of those today who were not deported, because after the adoption of White Australia, most South Sea Islanders were deported. Here's a image of people being mustered for deportation in Cairns in 1906. Those who remained have adopted the name Australian South Sea Islanders. So the South Sea Islander name is kind of perpetuated in that name. And I'd like to, as I said, acknowledge any South Sea Islander descendants or peoples who are here today. And I think Imelda Davis, chairwoman of the Australian South Sea Islanders of Port Jackson here in Sydney, she was going to try and join us. And if she is listening in, I'm really honoured to have her participate. This is the ASSIPJ website. Now, the reasons that this link between Australian sugar and Atlantic slavery is so compelling and so important is twofold. Firstly, sugar was the crop and the industry most associated with slavery in the Atlantic world. So whereas in the US, it was King Cotton, of course, in most of the Atlantic world, sugar is the industry that the majority of enslaved people are working in. It's also particularly deadly, which is one of the reasons that it's so associated with slavery. So I know, for example, that in Cuba, at the height of the sugar boom there, the average life expectancy for an enslaved person, regardless of how young they were when they arrived from Africa, will be about 7 years. And so because of this association of sugar and slavery, it's sugar planters who get most of the payouts at the time of the abolition of British slavery. It's sugar planters who are getting these really big payouts from the British government for the loss of their enslaved people. And this is also the industry that, as Jane mentioned last week, that pioneers what became known as indentured labour, mostly in the British Caribbean. These were people from India, from the Indian subcontinent. And the second reason that this link is important, I think, is that from the earliest times that South Sea Islanders came into Australia, this was derided as a form of slavery, of the slave trade born anew. You can find literally thousands of these news stories, pamphlets, books, calling this a new form of slavery from the 1860s onwards. Here are just two that I found. And it was normally missionaries and other people like that, often at the start, who called this slavery born anew. But towards the end of this era, there was also a lot of people who supported the White Australia policy, which also denounced this as a slave trade. And so these were people that felt that, not that this was an abuse of Pacific Islanders and that's why it should be abolished, but because only people of European origin should be settling or living here in the Australian, what would become the Australian nation. Now, that background is, I think, quite reasonably widely known, but I think there are far more links that have come into view much more recently that are more nuanced, more about individual people, about genealogies, and also about much bigger questions, I think, than simply whether you could dam the Pacific, what was known as the Pacific labor trade, with the term slavery. I think we can understand much more about this subject than those broad brush generalizations. So many of the earliest sugar planters in Australia came from or had some connection to the West Indies or possibly Mauritius. Many of them had what was known as West India backgrounds, which could mean any number of things. And so too, many of those who carried the first South Sea Islanders into Australia were the sons and grandsons of major Atlantic slave traders. Benjamin Boyd, who got started on this long before anyone else in the 1830s, was eventually killed in the South Pacific. He was the son of a major London slave trader who had argued against the abolition of the slave trade in 1808. And in fact, Benjamin and his brothers and sisters had been brought up with an African child who'd come back from one of his father's slave ships. I could make a guess at where this child had been put on board the slave ship. I it's not particularly relevant here. But this is just a map of some of the voyages made by the firm of Colclough and Boyd, which was the Boyd in that company was Edward Boyd, Benjamin Boyd's father. And what's interesting to me about that is that Benjamin always put that African child as a member of the family, and that this was something to do with humanitarianism. But in actual fact, the child, who would grow up to be a man, obviously, the child had just been too sick to sell. He was of no value in the slave markets of the Caribbean, and this is why he ended up in Britain. And although they describe him as a member of their family, he calls their father master, and that's the same terminology that Benjamin Boyd expected the Pacific Islanders to call him. Now, the first sugar in Australia was grown not by this man, although he would always claim that honour. That's this is Thomas Allison Scott, after whom the suburb of Tascott is named, up near Gosford, north of Sydney. And he always claims that he grows the first sugar in Australia. I think even if you look in the Australian Dictionary of Biography, it says that. But that's, I mean, complete nonsense. The person that grows the first sugar in Australia is a person of African origin who comes here as a convict. Now, Thomas Allison Scott was the son of an Antiguan planter in the West Indies. He at one point works in his maternal uncle's slave trading company in Liverpool in the UK. He then goes to manage his father's plantation in Antigua. And the man who he ends up growing sugar with and claiming as his own in Australia is an Antiguan he's almost certainly an enslaved person who who escaped by signing on board ship as a cook, pretending to be a free man. He gets to London, he gets to the UK, he commits a small crime. I think he stole either some food or some clothes trying to get to London, and ends up here as a convict. And so, ironically enough, the first sugar in Australia is grown by an enslaved man who had, a formerly enslaved man from Antigua, stood over by a former Antiguan planter. That's the kind of more true story of Australian sugar. And then this man, Captain Lewis Hope, or I'm not sure if you say Louis or Lewis, I'm sure someone can tell me, but he was the first man to put together sugar production and South Sea Islander labour in Australia. You can still visit his house up just over near the Queensland and New South Wales border on the coast. And he is interesting because he is one of the, certainly in my own work, the kind of less wealthy people who came from the West Indies or had this background advertised it, and the kind of bigger, more wealthy people did not. And Lewis Hope was definitely one in the did not category for reasons that I will explain. I also cut in, this is a zoom in of the picture I just showed you. So this is Pacific Islanders on Lewis Hope's plantation in about 1871. Now, the interesting thing about Lewis Hope is that he always goes around in Australia advertising that he is the son of the Earl of Hopetoun, as he was, but he never, conveniently enough, mentions who his mother's family were. They were the Wedderburns, who were major slave traders and sugar planters in the West Indies, as you can see there on the left. And they had become notorious twice over. They were notorious, first of all, because Jane mentioned last week the Somerset decision, which is the first, one of the long series of legal cases on the way in Britain to abolition. And the Somerset case was first tried in court through one of Robert Wedderburn's former slaves, whose name was Joseph Knight, who he had taken with him back to Scotland, and who then sued Wedderburn, this is Lewis Hope's grandfather, in the courts for keeping him enslaved in Britain. And Joseph Knight wins that case, and the Wedderburns become slightly notorious. And they become much more notorious a few years later when this man, Robert Wedderburn, arrives in the UK and announces that he is the son of James Wedderburn, so Lewis Hope's great uncle, through a rape that was perpetrated on one of his enslaved women in the Caribbean. And this becomes a much bigger scandal still. And in fact, that's so scandalous that some of the families subsequently adopt the name Colville instead of Wedderburn. And Lewis Hope, who, you know, obviously has his father's name Hope, just conveniently never mentions that part of it. But I think it's interesting to know about this Colville connection, because in fact, Andrew Colville, so someone who has he's Lewis Hope's uncle, because his grandfather has passed away by this time. Jane was talking last week about the sugar planters in Guyana who bring in the first Indians who are known as indentured, not enslaved. And Gladstone was the figurehead of that scheme. It was him who wrote the letters, him who you know, probably got the idea from his son in Mauritius. But in actual fact, he didn't work alone on that. Two of the people he worked with in this very small group of people were Andrew Colville, Lewis Hope's uncle, and also a man named Henry Davidson. And in fact, it's Henry Davidson's plantation, co-owned with the Berkeley family, that the first Indians arrived on board the Whitby. That's a replica of the ship. So Highbury Plantation, where the first Indians arrived, is owned by two men named Davidson and Berkeley. Well, Berkeley and Davidson is more commonly the way the company was known at that time. And there are some, a few years ago, I didn't take that picture, there's some descendants commemorating Arrival Day on Highbury Plantation 2017. That's an annual event. And that matters to this story, not just because of this looking at how labour played out in the British Empire after abolition, but because the son of Henry Davidson, in fact the only son, he has one sister but he's an only son, is this man who you can see there on the right, John Ewan Davidson. And he follows slightly beyond Lewis Hope. He is the doyen, it's often said, of the Mackay sugar industry. So Mackay is the, you know, the kind of locus of sugar production in Queensland. And John Ewan Davidson is very much a leader of that. So I make this slide, the picture on the left is actually a floor to ceiling length marble statue of John Ewan Davidson's grandfather, which is in a church outside of London. And he was one of the main plantation owners in Jamaica during his lifetime. He owned 26 plantations. I don't have a picture of Henry Davidson, John Ewan Davidson's father, but he was an extremely wealthy Guyanese planter. This is the person that owned Highbury Plantation, where the first Indians arrived. And then the one who comes to Australia is John Ewan Davidson. And one of the things I'm going to do when when the borders reopen, I can eventually get out, is to make some kind of film looking at the three generations of men and the three kinds of labour that they so exploited, and the descendants of all of those people and kind of where they are today. And just to give you an idea of the kind of money that Henry Davidson got as a slave compensation payout at the end of slavery in the British Empire. He was one of the kind of outliers, or he and the Berkeley family were the outliers of this. So the total for him, his three brothers also got massive payouts as well, but this is just John Ewan Davidson's father. So approximately, and these things are never accurate obviously, so approximately 28.6 million today, which was on top, of course, they had huge debts, but it was on top of the vast amount that the family had from centuries of slave labour that they had appropriated at this point. And it's also worth knowing that John Ewan Davidson is the person that at the end, as the White Australia policy is creeping closer, he is the person that goes back to London to beg that this trade is not stopped and that he is still allowed to keep these Pacific Islanders. And that's, of course, he's a great person to do that because the Prime Minister at that time is William Ewart Gladstone. So in other words, it's his father's old friend's son. These are people that have known each other forever, I think. And it's clear that Davidson's model for plantations in Queensland was what he had known his parents speaking about and his grandfather speaking about in the West Indies. He imagined this huge plantation, much bigger than most people were imagining in Queensland, with this huge population of black men, as he called it. I'm going to pick out what black meant in this terminology in a moment. And him in his great house and him having some kind of paternal control over them. That's what he imagined. And this is really the first main point that I want to make, that for the Australian sugar industry, the West Indies was not just a source of investment, although it certainly was, and it was not just a place to reinvest emancipation payouts, so to get some emancipation payouts from the West Indies and then a generation later reinvest it in Australia. That certainly went on. Nor were the West Indies just a place for Queensland planters to get experts and expertise to send for a sugar boiler or an engineer or a plantation manager or even a slave driver from Cuba, where slavery just went on, although all of those things happened as well. In fact, I have a list of more than 200, I think now, men that arrive, and a few women, but it's the men that are the workers obviously, arrive in Australia from the West Indies to work on sugar plantations. Now on top of those things, the slave societies of the West Indies and also Mauritius functioned as a blueprint for how Australian sugar might work. This is why Queensland has places named Antigua and Cuba, and I know Queenslanders pronounce it Habana, but nonetheless, that is, it was named after the capital of Cuba, obviously Havana. The B is the original Spanish spelling. Originally, it was pronounced Habana. And St. Lucia, of course, where the University of Queensland is, and all of these were owned by families who had been West Indian sugar planters or had parents who had been West Indian sugar planters or enslaved owners, some connection of that kind. There are also some Mauritian names scattered around as well. I'm probably missing some. But a much more important legacy of West Indian slavery in Queensland was that in the minds of Britons of this era, as Jane mentioned, that slavery really had come to only mean the type of slavery in the West Indies and the American South and perhaps Mauritius. It didn't even really mean this kind of slavery that existed in British India, although, you know, that's a whole other subject that someone who knows much more about it can talk about. But what it didn't mean, certainly, was the kind of slave societies that existed in many other parts of the world, for example, across Africa, and more relevantly here, across the South Pacific. So slavery had come to only mean a very particular form of slavery within the British Empire. And it was this that British people believed that they were fighting, and it was this that people like the Davidsons and Wedderburns had, and in their own opinion, I stress this as in their own opinion, it is this that they believe they have sacrificed their fortunes to give up. It is not any other kind of appropriation of labour that could be known as slavery in a different setting. It is only this legal chattel slavery that had existed in some parts of the Americas as kind of part of the capitalist world. So as long as these new labourers, like indentured Indians, for example, were not legally held as chattel, not legally listed on their belongings below their dogs and their cattle and their table, as long as that did not exist, as long as you could not give them to your daughter in marriage or whatever else, not to marry her, obviously, sorry, I mean to be her domestic servant, to give her as part of her bride wealth, as it were. If you cannot do that, they do not understand it as slavery. I'm not suggesting that's fair enough, by the way. I'm suggesting that is how they perceived slavery in this very narrow sense. And that's why in Queensland, men could and did argue that things like whipping South Sea Islanders, perhaps they'd been kidnapped, perhaps they were held in the dungeon. Lewis Hope seems to have had a dungeon that he held South Sea Islanders in. Certainly it was, you know, given that they would be paid a fraction of what Europeans earned, that in what they meant when they said this is not slavery was this perception that had come, I believe, from this bigger bigger Atlantic world definition of what slavery looked like. But there was, of course, another facet of the slave system in the West Indies and the American South that was utterly integral to it. Slavery was not just a legal system or a chattel system. It was also, of course, racial chattel slavery. And if ex-owners believed that they had given up and argued that they had given up the legal chattel part of their system to abolitionists, if they believed that is what they had surrendered, they most definitely did not give up the racial structures on which slavery had existed. And this was rarely demanded of them, perhaps only by a few of the most radical observers. It was really not perceived by the vast majority of people within the British Empire that giving up that the racial structure of slavery was of benefit to anybody. In fact, racial divisions strengthened very considerably in the years after abolition. Without any legal basis for West Indians of European origin being at the apex of those societies, they instead bolstered the racial basis that sought to make the poorest white men above the richest black men. And so the abolition of slavery across the Americas, of course, is not separate from the rise of so-called scientific racism. And that's a point that I really want to emphasize here, that the legacies of British slavery in Australia were not simply money or sugar expertise, although of course those things are very important, but they were also the broad constructions of race that obviously go far beyond the Australian colonies and the late 19th century and continue to infect the world today. I think in some ways they are so sort of omnipresent that we forget to unpick where they came from and how they arrived almost. And so that's why I chose the original quote that I had to begin, is the title for this chapter. And I mean, the word is in the original quote, obviously. I did not put the M word there for obvious reasons. I apologize. The Kanaka is also a very difficult term. But what's interesting about this is that this is said by Albert Augustus Messiah, who is from the small Caribbean island of Antigua. And he's a kind of wonderful and colourful character to study. So he finds himself in Queensland. He serves on labour ships, and he at some point has to defend or has to explain who he is. So this statement was in the court in Queensland in the mid-1880s, and they cannot, as I'm going to explain, they do not understand or pretend not to understand who he is. And so he has to defend himself by saying that he is not from one of these other two groups of people who are all in some vague way put together as blacks, all in some way vaguely put together as blacks when it suits Europeans to do that. And he has to stand there and say, no, 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 I'm a West Indian from Antigua, I have African blood, to explain who he is. Because the papers had been saying that he was a Pacific Islander, that he was all kinds of other things. And this is, so he throws their pejorative to insult back at them and says, no, no, I'm not those things. Now, Messiah also always claimed to be from Antigua, as I said. Here he is arriving into London in 1876. So he would have been born a free man. He then becomes a ship's cook. A very common career path for men of African origin from the West Indies. It was one of the few paths available to them. And there was some evidence that white sailors were kind of radical enough to treat men of African origin more fairly. On the other side to that is that they were generally the ship's cook, and that is one of the lowest ranks on the ship. Interestingly, it's not the lowest rank in the Pacific, what was known as the Pacific labor trade, because below that, on some liminal state between recruit and crew, is the boatmen who've been hired in the Pacific. And again, I'm using recruit as the terminology that they use. I fully accept that's not the way it was in many cases. So Albert Messiah is fascinating to me because he's one of the men of African origin, and there were actually quite a few, many more than we think, who ended up working as the crew, generally as the cook, sometimes as the steward, sometimes, which is a similar thing, but sometimes in other roles, but generally as the cook on Pacific labor ships. And although it's not the subject of this paper, I'm writing about them at the time, there's quite a few men of African origin who just refuse to join these ships or make a complaint when the ship becomes a Pacific labor voyage during the course of whatever it was they thought they were doing. And there's many cases where they try and compare it to Atlantic slavery, the stories that they've heard from their ancestors. And this is not just men of British West Indian origin, this is also African Americans, some of whom are just from directly from serving in the American Civil War. And it's interesting to me because that they make these complaints, because a lot of what people are arguing if they say that the Pacific labor trade was not slavery is that it was not like the Atlantic slave trade. And yet here are these men who have so many reasons to deny that this is the same thing, reasons I'm just going to get into, that still will make a stand at great risk to themselves and say, yes, it really is. This looks to me the same thing, or it looks enough like it to be deeply troubling to me. And I want to suggest that that this location between the decks of a Pacific labor vessel gives us a new insight into the racial legacies of West Indian slavery as they play out in Australia. And the point is that it was widely argued by people of European origin, as I said in the introducing Messiah, that they could not tell the difference between Pacific Islanders and people of African origin, at least when it suited them to do so. In some cases, this often also extended to First Nations Australians. And this was not as simple as the same, using the same pejoratives to attack or to denigrate all of those groups, although that happened all the time. For example, in Queensland, publicans could serve neither South Sea Islanders nor Indigenous people, but there were numerous cases where seamen of African origin, either British West Indians or who were British citizens, or African Americans, tried to get a beer or whatever and were turned down on the grounds that they could not serve blacks. And when this went to court, because often these black sailors would take this to court and go, I'm not banned from getting a drink, what, you know, what? The publicans could and did often argue that they could not be expected to tell the difference. And this seems to have been just a widely understood thing in the courts. And of course, this is, you know, what Messiah was saying, and he's one of the people that took this to court and said, I'm a British citizen, I'm allowed to have a pub in another British, I'm allowed to go to a pub in another British colony. So similarly, on board one of the ships, the Pacific ships that Messiah served on, it became notorious because he reported on the kidnapping and murders that had been committed aboard it, and he did that at great risk to himself. He was threatened with being lynched a number of times because of this. I've written about that somewhere else. I'm not going to go into the details of the case here, but one of the things that's thrown at him in that court case is that he had been able to go down into the hold where the married couples lived and rape the women. Now, of course, this is a common slur against men of African origin around the world in the 18th and 19th century. But the other sailors in this trial, what's interesting to me is that they don't say this to damn him in that way. They look upon it as a kind of, it's almost envy, because they say that he could get away with it because if the captain looked down into the hold, he could not recognize who Messiah was against the other South Sea Islanders. Whereas, of course, a man from Scotland or the boatswain was from Maine, he could, you know, they were not able to get away with this. So it's always this allegation that they are indistinct to people of European origin. And similarly, in the court case that results from Messiah's allegations about this, so these, by the way, this is the main voyage that he reports on, which becomes a scandal in Queensland. It's not to the normal Pacific slavery routes of what is now Vanuatu at the Solomon Islands. This is slightly more remote. This is up to off the east of New Guinea. And these places are still incredibly remote. And forgive me for, this is a small film, a bits of film, it's very bad, but this is me trying to reach there a couple of years ago. And it's still, I mean, it took about 12 hours on the boat to reach this place today. So how remote it was there then is not really, I can't even imagine really. But anyway, Papua New Guinea is today the place with the most, is the most linguistically dense place on Earth. And so all of these people that were kidnapped from these islands would not have been able to speak to each other. But nonetheless, in the court in Queensland, it is alleged that there's some magical language that everybody with that kind of skin pigment has that allows them to communicate with each other. So this is the extent to which it is perceived that there's one black, in the same way as one white, there's kind of one black. So, and Messiah actually ends up standing up in court and quoting Shakespeare to sort of go, I don't speak any other languages. I only speak English. I was raised as a British citizen. This is who I am. So I need to speed up. So this continual blurring of the lines between South Sea Islanders, particularly those called Melanesians from the Western Pacific, and people of African origin, really affects, I think, how we understand, and that blurring of the lines between those categories really affected what happened, in my opinion. The term Melanesian is from the Greek word for black, just as Negro came from the Latin for black originally, and the islands where Messiah happened to sail on board the Notorious Hopeful are New Guinea, of course Guinea, the other three nations of the world today called Guinea are in Africa. It had been given that name because of some perceived similarity to Africa. And the people from there had for a long time been known as Papuan Negroes. And I got this picture from Chris Ballard's book, Oceanic Negroes, the British Anthropology of Papuans from 1820 to 1869. And of course, again, about Guinea, the slave trade had often been known as the Guinea trade. And so here are people again going to another place called Guinea to get a group of people that they claim are in some way connected to Africans. Now, Reid Mortensen, who is a legal scholar, suggests that the color of Melanesian people, this is his terminology, and the imagined African origins of Melanesian people, that's a quote. It was this that led to the accusations that I showed you at the start, that this was a new kind of slavery. He believes that people looked at these people that looked like Africans or were alleged to be related to Africans in some way and perceived that it must be a new kind of slavery. But to me, that formulation is better made in reverse. And it's because Pacific Islanders were believed to look like Africans that they were considered suitable for sugar work in Queensland, and for a type that may not have looked like slavery to planters who just arrived from Jamaica, but it sure did to a whole lot of other people. And it should be remembered that in the West Indies, the conditions of enslavement, the conditions of indenture and the way it was inflicted were regularly much harsher and closer to enslavement for people of African origin than for those of Indian or Chinese origin. And this perceived, and of course in our own terms, deeply racist idea that Pacific Islanders looked like Africans to the point that it was indistinguishable to white men and women what the difference was. I think that this is a lot of what damns Pacific Islanders. And I think that this is why simply classifying South Sea Islanders as indentured, quite apart from the slave question of whether they can be considered to be slaves or not in Queensland, quite apart from that, this legacy of British slavery is what damns them in this racial sense, and why just categorizing them as indentured doesn't even tell a part of the story, in my opinion. So Messiah, to conclude, succeeded in having the crew of the Hopeful convicted for kidnap and murder, something that caused an intense revolt. This is actually 3 or 4 years later that this is in the paper. And it's so controversial, again, because of this ideology of him being a black man. And there's not that many cases in Queensland history, there's some, but there's not many, where a white man is sentenced to hang. They were not hanged in the end, but they were sentenced to hang for killing people that are described as black. But what's much more unusual in this case is that it's on the evidence of Messiah, who is himself, in their opinion, also black. And so you can see here that years later there's this argument, he would not hang a white dog on the evidence of a black fellow. And Messiah is only, he turns it back on themselves by escaping from the lynch mob, by pretending to be, by being hidden by Pacific Islanders. So he does kind of get revenge on them for that, just to save his life. He lives out the rest of his life in Sydney, actually, not far from where I am here, in Balmain and in Leichhardt. He marries the barmaid who was beaten up for chatting up in Queensland, and that seems to be the end of what we know about Messiah. Unfortunately, he lives a colourful life till the end. Now, the people that he accuses of having kidnapped all these people and murdered others, as I said, they end up going to jail. They are sentenced, 2 of them are sentenced to hang. They are not eventually hanged. But to say that there's a controversy is astonishing, understatement. People try and rush the prison to get them out. People have tens of thousands of people sign petitions. It goes on for years and years. It's absolutely incredible. And eventually there's a royal inquiry. About 800 of them are sent home. And this is by far not the worst of what has happened. There's lots of cases of kidnapping and murder and whatever else. But I wanted to show this to finish, because here's some of those people being rescued from a plantation owned by John Ewan Davidson, who I introduced you to before. And here's some of their testimony about what had happened to them. These have not come in from the ship that Messiah was on. They've come in from another ship, but they are some of the people that his actions eventually rescued. And what's interesting about this is that Davidson again gets compensation for this. Now, this time around, it's compensation for the loss of their labour, not, as in his father's case, loss of for them as human property. But nonetheless, it's them, still the planter, that gets the compensation. And there's another couple of stings in the tail of this story that I think links us all the way back round to the legacies of British slavery. And one of those, well, the last point really is that as they took them home, as the British took them home, they took home these hundreds of men and less women. They took the opportunity to raise the flag on all of those small islands. This is actually from a couple of years earlier. The picture of this, the drawing of this, is under copyright, so I didn't use it. But this is a similar occasion a couple of years earlier. And the reason, and they do that, they take these men home, and the person in charge of that stands there and in the best Queen's English, which of course no one could understand apart from a couple of people who'd been to the mission school, and says, don't worry, you're now safe from kidnapping and from slavery, because you're safe in the arms of Queen Victoria, and British people don't agree with slavery, and so don't worry, it's all good, you're now safe. And I think that's a kind of you know, a kind of good place to end, in the sense that it brings us all the way back to this idea of humanitarianism and the ways that humanitarianism and slavery were, and abolition were so intertwined, but in really kind of ways that are more complex than any broad brush, any kind of too generalized statement, I think. All right, I'm going to end this show. Try and okay, let me stop that. Try and get someone else back. Jane, we can mute.
Yes, indeed. Here I am. Thank you so much. And I'm sure if we were all in the same room, there would be riotous applause at this point. That was brilliant. So I enjoyed it very much. I'm now going to take the rest of the time we have, a little under a quarter of an hour, and can I encourage participants to submit questions via the Q&A function. So we have a couple already, and I'll just start with Sinead Williams, who says, I grew up in Ireland and learned at school and university a great deal about the Cromwellian indentured servants sent to the Caribbean and treated very cruelly. I was in Barbados last January and heard from the Barbadian guards at the Garrison and Washington House firsthand about this. Why is it not more widely known? It is a very painful part of Irish and indeed Scottish history. So Emma, what do you? I'm sorry, you're muted now. Can you unmute there?
I mean, I think it is quite widely known. I don't know the answer. I think it is quite widely known. Whether these people were, we could argue for the next year or so about the treatment of those people, by the way. But I mean, I'm not in any way denying the immense suffering that went on. But I would suggest that if it is taught in school and university, then in a way that's kind of where we're trying to get to reintroduce the subject of South Sea Islanders. And if there's any South Sea Islander leaders here with us, they can speak to that, I'm sure. But that's kind of, without in any way trying to denigrate the story of the Irish, I think in some ways that's kind of what we're trying to get to, if that's any answer, which I'm not sure it is. But I think that part of the reason is that it is so controversial as to whether they were white slaves or not, which is such a muddied question that probably that's one for many hours of discussion.
Right, yes, thank you. I'm going to move over now. We did have a question submitted via chat from Fiona McGoffey, who leads our modern slavery network here at the University of Western Australia. And Fiona, there have been a few since then, has said, fascinating, would love to know if their descendants are around aware of the research. I'm not sure whether that refers to the plantation owners or the enslaved or the workers, or perhaps both.
The descendants of the Pacific Islanders who stayed definitely know. They have always, I mean, I can't generalize, but there's been a lot of movement to recognize this as slavery, to have a much bigger recognition of what happened. I'm often told by older Australians that this was once taught in school, but certainly my own students have not much idea about it. Although we're, you know, I'm in New South Wales, not in Queensland, but still, that's not any kind of explanation. In terms of the descendants of the planters, I mean, I meet the gamut of the gamut of whether people are prepared to deal with this or not. Many responses, I think, from both descendants and from the wider community. I think
perhaps your work.
I think we can imagine what some people have suggested.
And I would suggest that your work is very innovative. You know, you're one of the first people to actually explore these. So maybe there's also that sense that, you know, we are learning about it and beginning to reflect on it in collaboration.
And some people have been amazing. I mean, what always fascinates me about this, I think, is the number of people that are really, and this goes far beyond this project to other projects I've done, the people who are in some way horrified to know that they have some connection to people of African origin. And that kind of both blows my mind and pushes me forward. And on the other hand, people who are so willing to accept that and so fascinated by it and want to know all the contours of their history. So yeah, I think it's a learning curve. And I'm not pretending in any way that there hasn't been more welcome comments and interest than in negativity, but there's been a fair amount of that as well, which is what you expect.
Yes. Okay, so we have a question here about sharing the people who are participating. Unfortunately, I cannot respond to that right now, but Roscoe, Hal, thank you for that, and we will definitely aim to put the list of attendees on our website. Might be the easiest thing to do. I'm going to move on. Mark Dunn says, Emma, brilliant, thanks. Can you say a little more, if there's anything, on the links or legacies between the Boyd's 1847 South Sea Island adventures and those in Queensland from the 1860s onwards? Did any take their lead from Boyd?
That's a good question. I think he in some ways has introduced it as a concept. He had always used South Sea Islanders, has had so many other people on his ships, as has Robert Towns. That's how Robert Towns is the first person to restart this, after whom Townsville is named. And Towns has this similar seafaring background where he follows Boyd in a way in that they are familiar with South Sea Islanders from the years of working them on their ships, and then decide, well, we could just bring them into Australia and put them to work and, agriculture. Towns, as far as I know, never wrote that he was inspired by Boyd, but in another way he wouldn't, because Boyd had been damned for what he'd done and eventually gets killed by South Sea Islanders and goes bankrupt and many other things. But I think there's certainly a kind of continuation of the same idea running through, of people that South Sea Islanders had often been used in ships and in other ventures, and so to just bring them here for agriculture at a time that Indians and Chinese are being rejected by the Queensland authorities as suitable labour sources, it's a continuation, I think, more than, I do not know if he was directly inspired by that.
Okay, thank you. Malcolm Albrook from the Australian Dictionary of Biography, more of a comment than a question. He says, we'd obviously like to correct the Thomas Allison Scott entry, and he will be in touch. Angela Bullicott, Emma, thank you for a terrific paper. You mentioned Mauritius in passing a few times. I know that I think it's pronounced Demericks, brothers-in-law of Governor Darling, who had been in Mauritius before New South Wales, conducted trade between New South Wales and Mauritius in the early 19th century. Could there have been structural legacies of Mauritian sugar plantations in Australia, similar to what you've outlined for the Caribbean, if on a smaller scale?
Yes, I absolutely think there were, without any question. I've kind of focused on this to a large extent now, but I think there's probably at least as many come from Mauritius, because there's the Mauritius has a, I think it's a cholera epidemic in the 1870s. I have to remember what kind of epidemic it was, I think cholera. And so a lot of people come here from Mauritius at that time, and there's absolutely structural ties. What's fascinating about Mauritius really is that they haven't just had as Angela I'm sure knows, haven't just had slavery of African origin. They are the one place that's had slavery of Indian origin as well. And so they are, in a way, in a kind of unique way to pioneer this. And it's on the way to Australia for many ships coming from Europe. And many people have had, you know, a son in the West Indies and a cousin in Mauritius. So I think in some ways it's part of that same world. And because it's on the way here for many ships, that's a very obvious connection that I really need to do more on. And in fact, it wasn't that unusual for people arriving from Mauritius to bring some of their indentured servants with them. That was known as well, of whatever origin.
Great, thank you. So Babette Smith says she may have an ancestral connection to Thomas Allison Scott.
Oh, okay.
Is exploring that. We also have a couple of questions on chat, so I'm just sort of toggling back and forth. I wonder if you found any evidence of Queensland Native Police interactions with South Sea Island captive labourers. Yeah.
That's a great question. I have not looked at it. I mean, you know, I think that's probably something that Tracy Bannifinua-Marr looked at. I'm sure you know her work, so I don't know who the question came from. But I have not really looked at that. There is a huge connection between, of course, First Nations people and South Sea Islanders. There probably is. To be honest, I have not looked at that.
Right. So I'm just... So Amanda Nettlebeck says, could you elaborate on the compensation of Davidson for the loss of labour from the Pacific Islander workers rescued from his Queensland plantation? I'm wondering how or why he received compensation when their capture was successfully prosecuted in a Queensland court. If so, presumably slave compensation money from the West Indies capitalised the establishment of Davidson plantations in Queensland, and in turn compensation from Pacific Islander workers sustained that wealth.
So I think I got distracted with the first part of that question. The first part of that question is that, so the hopeful that Messiah was on is that they are successfully prosecuted, but then there's all of these other ships that have been going not to Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands or to any of the usual locations, but to these islands off eastern New Guinea, and they launch a royal inquiry into all of those cases. And so it's the majority of those men and a few women get taken back. So the ones on Davidson's plantation had not come from the hopeful. So although they are judged to have been wrongly taken, it's in the kind of grey area about whether that was truly. The people who have bought those on the Forest King to Davidson's plantation have not gone to jail for that. And so it's within the realms of acceptability in Queensland terms to pay him compensation for the loss of those labour, for the loss of their labour. But for example, I mean, there's not perceived to be this kind of shame over it. In the Burns and Filt records in Canberra, you can clearly see that they knew that these men had been kidnapped from the ship that Messiah was on, and they say, well, we'll just work them as much as we can till we have to give them up and just keep quiet about it. I mean, there's not that kind of level of shame. The planters are in Parliament, so they can push for compensation, basically.
Yes.
There was a second part of that question that I missed.
I think you, sorry, I'm just...
Did I answer it? Good.
I think you've elaborated and clarified that. Yeah, so thank you. And just, we've run out of time, but I am going to just search for, it's a bit tricky. Here we are. Sorry, my fault. You may be able to read this, Emma, but I'm looking at the one about was there ever a boycott from Meg Foster? Was there ever a boycott on Australian sugar due to these claims of slavery as it was in England during the abolition campaign? Did connections between the Australian sugar industry and slavery ever impair the industry's profits? I think you've spoken to that a bit, but if you have any final kind of comments.
I don't think so. It was just got through under the realms of not slavery and no issue, I think. There was a big issue, obviously, but it was, I'm not aware of any boycott. I'd be fascinated to know if there was.
Well, thank you so much. I think you've
Thank
thrown
you
up
very much, Jane. It was a pleasure.
Oh, look, it's just been wonderful. And thanks to all the attendees and for all of your questions. And hopefully there will be opportunities to follow some of these up in further seminars and forums. And just before I say goodbye, I'd just like to remind everyone that next week, my colleague, Dr. Jeremy Martins, will be presenting the third seminar in the series. So we'll see you next week. Thank you again, Emma. Fantastic. Bye.